The last inning. We're in the last inning. This is the last panel, the most important panel, I think, only in the sense that all the prior panels talked about the importance of social capital, talked about the importance of civic infrastructure. So this is the panel that, is essential to everything else in terms of building resilient communities. I am going to introduce Tom Deyo, who's going to introduce the panel in this final discussion. Unfortunately, Lois DeBacher, who is from Kresge, is not able to be here. She got sick this morning and unfortunately will not be a part of this conversation, even though she's been a critical part of the entire planning of this event today. And I might say on her behalf that she's been working, or Emerald City's been working with her over the last couple of months now on her new Kresge's, not her, but Kresge's new resilience portfolio, and specifically to carve out an equity dimension to that portfolio, which she emailed me earlier this week, just got approved by her board of directors, so that they look for on the Kresge website within the next, she thinks, a couple of weeks, by the end of this month, even as soon as the end of this month, if they're really diligent about it, we'll be putting some new money on the street for grassroots groups to begin to develop resilience strategies and plans and projects in their communities. So we're very grateful to be a part of that effort, and hopefully we'll begin to make a difference. So with that, Tom Deyo, take it away.
So I'm Tom Deyo. I'm with NeighborWorks America, and I'm joined here on the panel by Ashley Shelton, the Executive Director, One Voice Louisiana, and Matt Ryan, the Executive Director for Align, Alliance for Greater New York. I'll let them, as they introduce themselves, talk more about their organizations and their work in this area. But I thought the end of the last panel presented the perfect segue, right? It kind of closed with saying, how do we make this happen? It seems like it needs to have some community-based component to it. And so I felt like that was a perfect tee-up for how we wanted to talk about where the local on the ground meets this idea of resiliency. And NeighborWorks America, just for those who might not know, we've been around for 35 years. We're a network of 250 organizations that we support that work on the ground. And it's interesting as I think of this conversation that there's really been sort of an evolution of the idea of resiliency, right? When NeighborWorks started 35 years ago, resiliency was around trying to make equity and investing happen throughout communities in the country that were disinvested, right? And so what was resilience then was having resilient economies, vibrant communities where disinvestment was occurring. And now resiliency is taking not only that, but it's taking in the whole triple bottom line aspect to it too, where these communities are not only sort of vulnerable to disinvestment, but they are vulnerable to the environmental aspects of it as well. So it's sort of interesting how 35 years ago, resiliency, even though it wasn't used, had that sort of connotation to it. And in the mid-2000s, that resiliency got hit hard, right? The financial crisis tore out a lot of that resilient infrastructure that was built up over time to support those communities. That got ripped out. So now we not only have sort of restoring that part of resiliency, but we have this other part of resiliency of thinking about how climate change and environmental impact are on those communities as well. And NeighborWorks has really sort of focused on the idea of resident leadership since its sort of inception. And so we believe that the idea that residents need to participate in the agendas set up in their communities is paramount to the success of those communities, and that every community that's out there needs to have equal treatment of investment in it, character, and also just that where they live and the communities they live in should be of an equal nature to others. So we've built that up as a part of our infrastructure, and the groups that we have on the ground really pay attention to that. And before I hand it over to Ashley, I just want to reflect on two different storms and the infrastructure that was available. So when Katrina hit, NeighborWorks went in to sort of find a way to be supportive. And what we found was there just wasn't an infrastructure of community-based organizations throughout the city to sort of latch on to as the sort of place to go to find recovery and to find out where to go to connect to those populations wherever they dispersed to, or to help think about how that rebuilding went. So we spent a lot of investment and effort to try to build up those kind of organizations on the ground in New Orleans with the help of a lot of the locals. And today there are more of those organizations there. In contrast, when Sandy hit in New York, when we went about that same thing, we realized there was a network of organizations that we could go to immediately, and the response was totally different. It wasn't about trying to build up an infrastructure, it was about trying to tap into the infrastructure that was there. So I just wanted to sort of tee that up as sort of a contrast and a way to think about what, when you have civic engagement, how that can support a resiliency agenda. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley to sort of talk about One Voice Louisiana and the work, since she's working at a regional level, and then we thought we'd let Matt talk, because he's got a more grassroots sort of concept.
Good afternoon. I had the privilege following the storms in Louisiana to work for the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, and so I'll have a long, kind of interesting introduction of my work and who I am. But after the storms, Governor Blanco created 3 entities: the Disaster Recovery Foundation to hold all of the monies that were coming in from philanthropies and people from around the world, the Louisiana Recovery Authority that kind of held the policy and all of the federal funds that were coming down, and then the Louisiana Family Recovery Corps that really looked at, how are we going to be kind of creating some system overlap so that we could make sure that we were catching vulnerable folks falling through the cracks. And as the kind of vice president of programs for the foundation, one of the things that was really interesting kind of following the storms and really thinking about what was our purpose, and if we had, the Bush Clinton Katrina funds, we had $50 million worth of public support and outcry from people around the world. And so we thought about what could we do that would have the most impact. And one of the things that we knew was that civic engagement would be key, because at the end of the day, even though we had $50 million, the $50 billion that was coming from the federal government and from other places was going to be much more important for us to focus on and influence, so that we could make sure that those dollars actually got to the ground. And so for 7 years, that was the work that we did at the Disaster Recovery Foundation, and me specifically focusing on how you engage communities in these processes. And, I'll tell you a funny story about resilience and kind of what it means in Louisiana, is that internally to the state, resilience has this kind of funny connotation. We're very proud of the fact that Louisianans are strong, resilient people. We can take a punch better than most people around the country. But what is unfortunate, though, is that there is people lean into it in a way that is sometimes also burdensome to a very poor state, a very unhealthy state, a state that has lots of challenges. And so we were working really hard and diligently to try to make sure that people had opportunities to have voice in what was a very chaotic time. And it's been really nice today to see some old friends. And so I talked to John and Phil and Dana, and so many folks came down to help us. And to Tom's point, we definitely needed infrastructure. We were not prepared. We had no understanding of the magnitude of these storms, and needed to really build some capacity really quickly to get people engaged. And one of the undercurrents of kind of the chaos of Katrina was the idea that, we were going to have all of these planning processes to bring New Orleans back. And so I don't know if many of you remember the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. And they did this great mapping process where they laid out all these new green spaces, which just so happened to be people's neighborhoods, and churches, and communities. And that basically, if you didn't respond to this, the plan that they put out, that basically your community would basically be set as this map had kind of laid it out. And so, of course, there was so much fear and misunderstanding that came out of that, and the community really used that as a galvanizing point. And so we were able to really get people engaged, create access to information, and really shut down the kind of Bring New Orleans Back Commission. And not so much what they were trying to do, but more of an equitable process. And so out of that came what we call UNOP, which is a Unified Neighborhood. Oh gosh, I'm going to mess up the acronym, but the UNOP process. And then we worked in what we called a power block with both PICO, IAF, and at the time, and really did work across multiple states to be able to make sure that people could contribute to a planning process about how their neighborhoods were going to come back, how their voices could be included, and also to bust folks back and forth so that they could, contribute to and participate in those processes. And so when you think about community and equity and resilience, it was so difficult because so much stuff had already happened to people. Katrina happened to us. followed, immediately by Rita. And then all of these planning processes for the folks that had the greatest ability to be in the city at that time, were able to galvanize and organize really quickly. And so we had to do a lot of work to make sure that those disenfranchised communities, the elderly, communities of color had an opportunity to really be engaged in those processes. And so it's a, really, kind of powerful example of how fear created just an outcry from people from across the country saying, like, wait a minute, you can't just redraw New Orleans without the voice of the people. And so I'll put a pin there and kind of fast forward a couple of years to how I got to One Voice, which was, really after 7 years in philanthropy. Like I said, we did the Bush Clinton Katrina funds. We focused specifically on policy, housing, and community economic development, helping to restore businesses because we knew that they would put local jobs back in the streets and allow people to be gainfully employed. And when we looked at what was making the greatest impact, it was really the policy work that allowed us to be able to try to push as much of the money that was coming down as we could down to the ground. And unfortunately, it's not nearly as much as I thought that it would be, but we did have some successes around making sure that there were programs that met the needs of those that were impacted, and especially vulnerable families. And then as we've kind of looked forward at what is happening in New Orleans today, there's about $23 billion worth of infrastructure and redevelopment projects happening in the city as we speak. Recovery School District, Sewage and Water Board, any number of projects. We've got the Restore Act that is also being layered on, and we're wondering kind of what kind of green economies and other things can come out of the Restore Act. And then there's also too the layer of the energy boom that is happening in South Louisiana as well. And so in my role, I'm at One Voice. We've really been looking at the economic opportunity that is going to come from all of this development, but ensuring that it creates opportunities for apprenticeship, local hire. I always tease that they got 50 billion by me, but they're not going to get this next 100 billion by me. And so, we've really been working hard to make sure that we create information and access, push cards, helping people really identify where the points of power are and how as citizens they can be engaged in these processes, and allowing voice to really take place. Because another big issue, and I'm sure Matt can share as well, about how we communicate to neighborhoods and people in community. We sent out an email and said there's a community meeting, and we think that we don't understand why 10 people came to the meeting. And this notion that somehow everybody's got a computer, everybody's got access to the internet is so flawed when we look at, especially in a disaster paradigm, how people get information. And in fact, Steve Bradbury, who was at Acorn at the time, won the Kennedy Award for using text messages to be able to contact people and being able to really organize and figure out where their members were. And it was such a powerful idea back then because texting was relatively new. But just thinking about how are we creating ways to make sure that as we do all of these planning processes and think about how we restore our cities, how do we make sure that we engage people in those processes? And so I'll stop and let Matt talk.
All right. Am I on here?
Yeah.
All right. So it's good to be here with everyone. Again, my name is Matt Ryan, the director of Align, the Alliance for Greater New York. Align is a longstanding alliance of community and labor organizations based in New York. And I have to say, I'm also a native of the Midwest and St. Louis, organized for a long time in Cincinnati, and it was just really exciting to hear about the exciting work that's happening in the Midwest earlier in the last panel. So hopefully we can add another contribution here from the New York side. What I want to do is talk a little bit about our work after Hurricane Sandy, and specifically the creation of the Alliance for a Just Rebuilding, which was a broad community labor network that came together to really build both to address the short-term recovery issues, but also try to create a longer-term rebuilding and resiliency agenda. So for us, frankly, we were well aware of what happened in New Orleans. And as everyone began to hit the ground after Sandy and do organizing in Far Rockaway and in Coney Island and the North Shore of Staten Island and on Midland Beach, we were obviously activating those networks and doing the immediate recovery work. But we were also well aware that if we don't get organized and connected in some broader way across the city, state, and region, we do make ourselves vulnerable to possibly sweeping changes that are going to displace people. And specifically, I think that some of the bigger concerns when the storm first hit is we're talking about shorefront properties. These are very, very valuable properties for any real estate developer. And there's a lot of fear that if we're not getting in front of this $10 billion that's likely to come in, our cities could face displacement. We're not going to have access to some of the jobs that are going to be created. and we're not going to be a part of these plans longer term. So very much the same scenario. We benefited again from, I think, learning from our brothers and sisters in New Orleans and what they did kept going, and then also tapping into some of these networks that existed and the infrastructures that existed beforehand. So to be specific, it was really in December. Hurricane Sandy hit in October a couple years ago. It was in December when people started to get together in a number of churches and begin to say, we need to form some sort of broader configuration here to be able to impact this process. And in that developed the Alliance for a Just Rebuilding. Contained over 50 organizations across the city, and some of the prominent groups that were really leading in this were longstanding community-based organizations like Make the Road New York, Faith in New York, which is a part of the PICO network, New York Communities for Change, which is a group that was born out of Acorn's demise a couple years ago, and big labor unions such as SAU 32BJ, the nurses at NISNA, the Laborers Union, and many others. And pretty quickly, people came together to think about trying to focus on three things. And one was really networking and building the sort of multi-stakeholder organization that could maximize the political pressure we create. We don't want to atomize ourselves in each individual community. Secondly, making sure that the voice of working people was part of the debate. Very early on in the press, all the coverage was about generally a human interest perspective, tragedy, service provision, but it wasn't really having the voices of people directly impacted by this issue front and center and shaping the story. And then third, we really wanted to build an actionable agenda, something that we could proactively push and not just respond to the ideas that were pushed on our communities. So very much this was about trying to reframe the issue to really drive an equity frame, and it was taking a movement building approach to the crisis here. So a couple of things I want to highlight is when this happened, we began to get up and running. It happened to also coincide not too long after with the mayoral race in the city. And one of the things that we did that was really a big turning point was organizing a large candidates forum where all the mayoral candidates came together. It was in this moment that we issued our Turning the Tide agenda. So Turning the Tide became sort of the brand that we attached to our policy agenda, the proactive things that we want to do. And it was at this event where we mobilized over 2,000 people that candidate Bill de Blasio, now of course Mayor Bill de Blasio, made a very clear statement. So this is a quote from him that actually ran in the New York Times from the forum. Now with these new resources from the federal government, we have to use it as a moment, not just to right the wrongs of Sandy, but to start to right some greater wrongs. And so we really felt like this was a key point where we were able to say, yes, Sandy was a tragedy, but what it also did is it revealed some of the historic inequities that were in these communities way before the storm hit. And if we're going to have billions of dollars coming in, we of course need to meet those immediate recovery needs, but it would be a shame to not address the chronic long-term inequities that preceded the storm. So with that, we were able to catch a lot of momentum, organize a very, very big one-year anniversary event where thousands of people came from the different Sandy impacted communities as Sandy sojourners, met at City Hall and continued to build this political momentum. And I'll sort of close here with a few things that we've accomplished along the way and then where we're trying to get to. So one thing that happened at the end of last year was we were able to get the city to adopt a full-bodied policy of tracking how every single dollar is spent, but also making sure that local hiring and job quality is completely tracked along the way. So to your point about, well, who gets the jobs and what kind of pre-apprenticeship opportunities are there, apprenticeship opportunities, we were able to get that written into how we look at the money. And then we're happy to say that under Mayor de Blasio, a couple of his first appointments have made a clear commitment to make sure that all these funds are making sure they do local hiring and partnering with labor unions and other pre-apprentice programs to get people into these jobs in the construction that's created. So that's been a very concrete thing, and just next week we're going to be on the ground in Far Rockaway operationalizing this with local stakeholders. So that's been a really key one. To the point of sort of righting greater wrongs, we've been able also to get administration staff to say, this is really a pilot opportunity to test out this approach, but try to make this a matter of city policy whenever we have any public money spent into the future. Number two, we were able to get a lot of commitments around affordable housing and how the development is moving forward. So there's a number of land acquisitions that are happening right now. In those land acquisitions, we're getting covenants around protecting affordability. And there was a point earlier about land trusts and how we think about more innovative models. So this is something that's on the table. Decisions haven't been made, but we're really looking at can some of these land trusts be developed in Staten Island, in Far Rockaway, in South Brooklyn, and the social networks that have been built up across different community organizations, churches, and unions, they should have a seat at the table to guide this, and then this should then dovetail with hopefully what people have heard of. Mayor de Blasio's very exciting affordable housing pledge that he's already made. So that you sort of see how these streams are coming together into what we hope to be one broader movement around climate sustainability, good jobs, and affordable housing, or a city where we all have a right to live there. And then a final thing I would note is that we're continuing to try to build this long-term agenda. So it's actually just this morning I was in the city coming from a planning meeting for the People's Climate March, which hopefully people are going to hear more about as we move forward. There's going to be a large march coordinated around the UN Climate Summit that's happening this September in New York City. People hoping this is going to be the largest global march ever around climate. And what was most exciting to me is that many, many labor unions are becoming a part of this and really taking a sort of social justice approach to the issue and beginning to think, how do we build a long-term agenda around resiliency, but making sure we define resiliency as having three dimensions, both economic, social, and of course ecological as well, and then partner where we can with a progressive mayor like Mayor de Blasio to really take big strides forward in the city. So I'll stop there, but we're gaining momentum, but of course a lot of hard work to do in the coming future.
So staying sort of with that last point, many of these communities over time have really dealt with the socioeconomic side of things. Right now we're sort of introducing the environmental sort of area. How are the communities, and in the conversations you're having, is there a connection of those that are participating, seeing it across that triple bottom line, or do you use the opportunity to talk about the socioeconomic and then build up the environmental? Just curious, how do they all feel about, are they connecting with the resilient in the environmental side as well?
Well, I mean, I think in Louisiana, it's you can't ignore it. It is a big issue. One of the things that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about was right after the storms, we worked across states. It was Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, to really think about like what was happening to our states and the way the money came down from the feds. It was done in a way that kind of pitted the states against each other, because Mississippi got more money, but Louisiana had more damage, and Alabama was pretending like nothing even happened, or at least their Congress people were. And so we had to do some work around for vulnerable people in communities, what was happening to them, and the fact that pretty much their experience was the same, kind of across the board, across all three states. And with the leadership and support of Felipe Floresca, we were able to build out a campaign called Equity and Inclusion. And what was so interesting about that was that we allowed regular, everyday community people to engage in that process. We took trips up to DC. We did intensive training so that they could engage in a way so that they could actually meet with the people in Congress, make the points that we wanted to be made. And one of the things that was so interesting about building local leadership was that, one, when we got to DC, every office we went into, every staffer or congressperson that we met with said, "You're the first people from Louisiana, you're the first people from the Gulf Coast that's ever said what you needed. We've been hearing from everybody else what the Gulf Coast needs, but we never heard from you what that was." And in the midst of the asks, that we've kind of put together as a coalition, the climate change and the environmental piece was huge, because as people living in community, you know how important it is to have a levee when you live in Terrebonne. You know how important it is when you have 5 values in your parish, which is the same thing as a county, that like you are, hugely vulnerable as a community. And so it is not lost on community folks how important these issues are, and that how they also too are layered and connected to the socioeconomic issues. But in addition to being the first time they'd ever heard from someone from the region what they actually needed, the second thing that happened was the building of long-term relationships. In southern states, we oftentimes find that we can have alignment at the local and federal level, but it's really hard to get the state to move in the ways that we want the state to move. And so we've used that to our advantage. So, the state wouldn't do what we wanted to do. Every once in a while, HUD would make it hard for our CDBG allocation to move quickly. And so we were able to get some more equitable things done in terms of having conversations about housing, EPA. We were able to build long-term relationships, lasting relationships that exist to this day between community folks in Houma, Louisiana, and at the time, Lisa Jackson, but actually to be able to move policy and move conversations about what was happening in their communities. And I think that that's, the kind of work that pays long-term dividends that, 10 years ago, we did some hard work training, engaging, understanding what the issues were in community, and then unleashing them on the hill and saying, ask for what you want, ask for what you need. And those folks today are still engaging with HUD, EPA. Now we're working with labor and other folks, and I think that that's a really powerful opportunity. And even one of the groups that we work with now, the Bunny Friends Neighborhood Association, and that's really the name of their neighborhood. From those trainings 10 years ago are now, helping us help them do look at a naval base that has been given to the city and how that naval base could create jobs and opportunities for their communities. And so I think that one of the things that they're super concerned about is that being in the Upper Ninth Ward, that the naval base is a great job center and opportunity, but then also too, how do they also make sure that they're creating protections as they're right along the river? And so, I think that it is showing up more and more for folks, how we have these conversations that transcend socioeconomic, because it's directly linked in Louisiana. You can't ignore the environmental concerns, but they go right hand in hand, unfortunately and fortunately, with the socioeconomic.
And I may just share two examples that I think really highlight this notion of social resiliency. So in the South Bronx, there's been two groups I think have done some pretty phenomenal work, Sustainable South Bronx and The Point. And these are two groups that come out of the environmental justice movement, and for a long time have had a very clear analysis around climate and environment that really factors in racial justice and equity. And probably for a time it wasn't that popular. I think this is becoming more widely understood right now. And it's really, I guess, in some ways, literally paying dividends, where these groups were very organized. They engaged in a rebuild by design process where millions and millions of dollars were going to be allocated to specific projects post-Sandy. And I believe it was just a couple of days ago, the project that they had helped define and propose was awarded, I believe it was almost $80 million. So to me, there was one example. We have a long-standing set of community organizations, a very clear intersectional analysis of what needs to be done, and an ability to engage in a process when it comes in a meaningful way. It's not tokenistic, but you're actually there, you have ideas, and you're able to get it done at the end of the day. So I think the environmental justice movement in New York City has done a lot of impressive work, and it's bearing out right now. And then I'd say some of the groups that are newer to the picture but doing really phenomenal work, I would lift up the Nurses Union in New York. So NISNA is doing something right now after Sandy and after the impact of so many nurses just getting on the ground and helping people. And it's a fairly simple idea, but they're just calling it learning lunches. And they're going hospital to hospital and talking about climate change and how it's going to impact nurses as sort of frontline workers that have to deal with these issues in moments of tragedy, but are also dealing with the effects of climate change, such as asthma and other health-related issues. So this has just been a simple thing that they've been doing, but it's starting to educate the membership, and it's gone as far as now at the bargaining table with their master contract. One of their demands that I just learned about a week ago, which I think is really brilliant, is they have a contract demand that next time a disaster strikes in New York City, a certain number of workers automatically get to leave the job, continue to get paid, and do disaster recovery. And in the meantime, they're going to continue to build these networks across their union, other community groups in frontline communities or Zone 8 communities that are vulnerable to disaster. So here's an example of just using the bargaining framework to really do something proactive about climate, committed to long-term community building and movement building, and really thinking about, at least as a union nurse, these are the skills I can help bring, and this is a way to be in solidarity with people long-term. So just two ideas that I've seen recently that I think are really inspiring.
So you both are talking about things that happen in response to a significant event, right? That doesn't happen in every community, right? So, and community building and organizing, and that is a very complex and long process. So are there any keys that you would say would be, for those communities who don't have that catalyst to sort of get them moving, that you might put on the table as, how to get that organizing happening and get involved in these issues locally, so that resilience is about getting a defense ahead of the storm happening. So any keys that you might offer up in terms of
Sure. In Louisiana, one of the things, and I tell folks too, resilience. So we had Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, and then the BP oil spill, which people don't. I put it as an environmental event as well. And I think that as someone whose home was intact, family was intact, but that was in it every day doing the work as a staff person for a foundation. You know, specifically looking at community and community organizing, you know, I struggled with being, I was like, this is too much, you know, like y'all asking too much of me to be resilient in the face of every time we got to a place where we could actually have successful outcomes at the community level, you know, it'd get undone, and we'd have to go back and work with the fishers, work with the oystermen, work with, you know, all of the folks that we had just repaired their boats, just, you know, kind of done all of this stuff. To get back to your question, you know, one of the things that I think we have really found to be really powerful, and also to kind of something that I would definitely say be proactive about if you haven't had an event, is that we have just demystified power. I think that in Louisiana, you know, we have lots of really old laws that kind of govern how we do things. I am proud to say that our Constitution has at least been changed in the recent future, in the recent past, but at the end of the day, it's really difficult to actually help citizens navigate power in their communities and at the local level. And so we have done things like push cards that break down the planning process. After we got through the unified planning process, you know, citizens are really concerned about now we're going to codify the planning process with this, you know, comprehensive zoning ordinance. And folks said, well, what does that mean? And so we did a lot of work just educating people, just taking out the fear and empowering them to be involved in those processes. And I think it's really easy to kind of help people, you know, kind of do the work of understanding, like the mayor has this power, the city council has this power, you know, whatever board or aviation or otherwise is doing, you know, work on different issues, like here's how the power works so that you can actually help people help themselves. And I think that one of the things that we did a lot of as, you know, at the time I was working for a foundation, but even now as a statewide nonprofit, we convene. And I think that's oftentimes the folks that are making decisions about people's lives are way up here and people in community are way over here somewhere. And we did hard work to hold them accountable and to create spaces where they had to come and be accountable to people in community and really hear from them about what their needs were, what their questions were, because I think we wanted to get to a place where we wanted stuff to stop happening to us, and we wanted to actually be able to proactively think about what it is that we wanted our communities to look like. You know, how do we make these opportunities happen? And I will just say too that the Southern paradigm also makes that complicated, because as you talk about climate change, you know, we don't talk about climate change. And it's also too, you know, really difficult to have environmental conversations and to be able to proactively address some of those issues at the community level when the layers of bureaucracy and the people that actually have the power to make decisions about what's going to happen in your community are, you know, largely, you know, campaigns funded by business and industry. And so we have been doing a lot of work to increase civic engagement and help people really come to the table on the proactive side and say, well, let's start electing people that really care about your issues. How do we have candidate forums that really look at the issues, you know, that people care about? And we saw with the last local races in New Orleans, I was very proud to say that so many of our nonprofit partners were able to hold candidate forums on a plethora of different issues. You know, one of the things that we have done that I think has been a really powerful lever for people in community is that we do data for the purposes of policy action. So we're not a data shop by any stretch of the imagination. But, you know, what we found was that lots of local neighborhoods and communities can, you know, describe in detail what was happening to them, but they couldn't figure out how to then connect it to what policy allowed that to happen to their neighborhood, or, you know, what was allowing the water to not drain from their community property. They couldn't figure out what policies and who they needed to talk to. And so we would oftentimes create, you know, documents and things for them so that as they went to go and talk to different city council members or the mayor or state government, they would actually have the tools that they need to be able to illustrate and very thoughtfully talk about what that was. And even for those elections, we did district profiles for every district in New Orleans, broke down capital projects, race, poverty. We looked at unemployment. We looked at lots of different things so that you can just help people engage with what's happening to them in their community.
Yeah, I think and to build on that, one thing that we're trying to learn how to do more and learning as we go is really thinking about, as you're noting, when we do power analysis, I think we need to really think that, or at least acknowledge that many of the forces and the powerful corporate forces behind the climate agenda are the same forces that are leading to the economic crisis and the economic inequality that we so profoundly face. So it seems like we don't often enough have the conversation where, yes, let's say the Koch brothers is a powerful force in the fossil fuel industry that's helping drive climate crisis. It's not, this is the same set of folks and actors that are driving ALEC and a lot of the forces out there that are driving down wages and so forth. One thing that we're trying very hard to do is think like, how can some of that basic power analysis and recognition of where the sort of big corporate agenda is hitting on both sides lead to some interesting collaborations and organizing. So I'll be honest, we haven't successfully figured that out yet, but we are talking intensely with groups that are really leading on some of the innovative low-wage worker organizing, groups that are leading on the environmental justice front and climate justice front. And then in New York, we have a wonderful thing called the Working Families Party, and so we're trying to figure out what's the political expression of this work as well. So I'll be honest, we haven't figured it out, but the good thing is we are all talking every single week and trying to figure this out. And I do think, to your point, that education and power analysis and understanding how the political power actually shakes out is of course one thing in one dimension of it. One area where I think we're seeing some pretty exciting work is in divestment campaigns. So I know 350.org is doing this and really thinking how do students get involved and really lobby to divest resources at a school from the fossil fuel industry. And harkening back to the panel before me, I mean, of course you can start to extrapolate and think about ideas where we're really focused on divesting from actors that are not doing the right thing, but then proactively investing in some more transformational approaches such as cooperatives and other things of that nature. So, again, we're kind of seeing this, I would say, in silos. We're not collaborating as much as we possibly could, but to me that's sort of the inklings of something that could be pretty exciting.
I guess is one final, and maybe it can tee up the cards, is there could be some metrics in this which are, driven towards, the energy efficiency and the affordable housing, which is sort of a unit count. The idea that this becomes sort of a resiliency agenda, right, to sort of talk about how that has an impact on the environment or on the sort of global climate change, because it's when you get to the outcomes you talk about system. So are the conversations there that people are seeing because you can talk to the metrics pretty quickly and you can measure that, you can count it, right? The outcomes but the outcomes is where you're driving. So do the conversations move upstream, and are you getting to the conversations about those larger outcomes?
I'm working on it, I think is the answer. I mean, I think in our experience, I mean, we just finished the legislative session, and I mean, we're brutally, we lost minimum wage, we tried to regulate payday lending, we talked about equal pay, and so these are all really difficult things to do in Louisiana, apparently. We talked about local hire, also too, very difficult to talk about in Louisiana. We talked about some other climate pieces as well, and just kind of were hammered. And so as you think about one of the things that we've been trying to do is to turn some of those conversations among local leaders and local community groups into opportunities to really begin to think about 2015, which we have a governor's race, and we have all our Senate and House state races in 2015 as well, and trying to think about how do we use the things that we wanted to happen, the resiliency conversation. How do we use that to create a bigger frame for the folks that get elected to office, in our state? And certainly we're a 501c3, so certainly from an issue perspective, I just give the disclaimer. But thinking about how do you use things like the van and other tools to be able to really help people engage. But one thing I will, say that's interesting as well is that our leaders have gotten really smart. So, through some support of Oxfam, a group called BISCO, which is in Houma, Louisiana, we're able to work together to, and we worked with them as well, to push through the Insurance Clarity Act. And we've talked a little bit about insurance today, but in Louisiana, it is a totally different ballgame to talk about insurance and the issues there. But as we have been able to build power over the course of 10 years, we were able to get a bill through the legislative session, which is one of very few victories, so we're so proud of it, that really forces insurance data transparency so that we understand how, one, the formula is calculated, and then also, two, what are, the insurance rates by zip code, so that there can't be, all of this cloudiness around why my rate is so high and why someone else's rate is lower and those kinds of things. And so as folks have used the environment to, maybe further disenfranchise certain communities, we're now seeing our advocates gain power and voice and be able to use those same things kind of to create more equity and voice in those processes. And so I think we're getting lift, but I think that we're also trying to figure out what are the, what are the structures and what are the frames that allow us to have that framework work for us in a state that I think it's really difficult to have resiliency mean what you mean and not what our governor thinks it means. So
I'm not familiar with too many metrics that tell you have a resilient community, or sort of we think about civic resiliency, and maybe I just don't know about them, but I think there's actually a big gap. And there's, of course, a lot of wonderful metrics that we use in New York City, and I think Mayor Bloomberg made a lot of progress on that, really pinpointing how many metric tons of carbon emissions are we reducing, and we're able to really track progress there and think about those sorts of climate metrics. We do have metrics, as we were noting, around jobs and local hiring and things of that nature. But I mean, one of the stories that really sticks with me is that there was a disaster plan of what New York City would do in the event of an extreme weather event like a Hurricane Sandy, before Hurricane Sandy. And the story everyone tells is that that plan, people basically threw it out the window the minute the storm hit. And what they did is they went to the ground and they tapped into these networks, and it was really those networks and people who trusted one another and knew what everyone uniquely had to add in that situation that was able to get things done. And there were so many things that just popped up that were not necessarily organic because they were there beforehand, they were just activated. So I think a challenge for us, and I would argue a challenge for the funding community as they think about how do we really invest dollars in a wise way to promote civic resiliency, is, well, what would be metrics that matter when you think about building community? Because ultimately we really are trying to foster relationships, build trust, build understanding across different sets of stakeholders and institutions that have their own logics and often very different logics. But I think our experience was those relationships probably matter more than anything when you're dealing with climate crisis, you're dealing with more extreme weather events. So I don't really have an answer. We are trying to figure this out, and we can measure, I think, in some ways where these relationships have been built, and the coalition gets bigger, more people come to your rally, more people come to the next community forum, things of that nature, right? But it's a challenge, and I think it's really strikes at the heart of what we need to figure out.
I think that's important. One of my former bosses says, you are what you measure. So then it is what you measure leads to what outcome, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you have to tie that all together because, ultimately the outcome is what you're driving to, and the measurement is about figuring out whether you've achieved the outcome too. So I think with that, we're hand it over to Denise.
It's a very, very important conversation, and thank you all for being in this struggle and truly building resilient communities. One of the things that I would suggest that we do as a recommendation is to make sure that we are investing in, when we talk about resilience, in community organizing, in community capacity. I fear that a lot of the resilience money goes to government, municipalities, to do planning. But we know, I lived through two disasters. One was the civil unrest in LA. Now, of course, that was a man-made disaster. And the other was the Northridge earthquake. And it was clear, and it happens every time, we see it every time, that we rebuild off the backs of communities. But we never invest in those communities. And we see it again and again, and we are our own first responders, and we never get supported to do this work and to have the skills to be prepared for this. So we have to be proactive and make certain that we have strong communities. And thank you for all of your perspectives on this.